Hyun Woo built his empire on one unbreakable rule. Nothing moved in his world without his permission. At 38, the Korean billionaire was known for precision that bordered on ruthless. Markets shifted when he entered them. Rivals disappeared when they miscalculated. And emotions, the one weakness that had destroyed stronger men, had long ago been removed from his decision-making. Or so everyone believed. Tonight, the security floor beneath his private tower was running its usual midnight sweep when something unusual surfaced. Not an alarm. Not a breach. Pattern. Hyun Woo didn't look up immediately. He finished reviewing the numbers in front of him, calm and methodical, before his gaze finally shifted to the highlighted file. Name: Amara Okafor. For the first time in years, his hand stilled. Across the glowing screen, surveillance markers were clustering too close to her location. Quiet, deliberate movements that most systems would have ignored. But his never did. And neither did he. Something cold moved through his chest. Not fear. Recognition. Because Hyun Woo had walked away from Amara years ago for one reason only. Distance was the only way to keep her alive. Now his enemies were circling her without even knowing why. And the most dangerous man in Asia was about to break his own rule. The first rule Hyun Woo ever carved into his empire was simple. Mercy creates openings. By 32, he had built a network that stretched across continents. Shipping, finance, private security. Acquisitions that happened quietly and stayed buried. In boardrooms he was known as precise. In darker circles he was known as inevitable. Hyun Woo preferred efficient. He did not raise his voice. He did not repeat himself. And he never made the same mistake twice. Years ago, when his rise was still being watched with skepticism, a rival had tried to test his restraint. A small betrayal. A quiet move meant to see how far the young executive could be pushed. Hyun Woo ended the man's entire operation in 48 hours. After that, no one tested him casually again. He stood now in the quiet expanse of his Seoul penthouse office. City lights scattered beneath the glass like obedient stars. One hand rested behind his back, posture perfectly still, as live intelligence reports scrolled silently across the wall screen. Patterns, numbers, movement, control. This was the language he trusted. Emotion, on the other hand, was inefficient, unpredictable, expensive. Hyun Woo had learned that lesson early, watching powerful men fall not because they lacked strength, but because they hesitated when it mattered most. He had never hesitated. Not in negotiations. Not in acquisitions. Not even when force became necessary. Especially not then. His executives understood the unspoken rule that governed everything beneath his name. Problems were removed, not managed. Cleanly. Permanently. Kept the empire stable. Kept enemies cautious. And it kept his world quiet. A soft chime pulled his attention back to the main display. Another risk analysis report finalized. Lines of probability settling neatly into acceptable margins. Hyun Woo studied it without visible reaction. Predictable. That was how he preferred things. Because unpredictability usually came from one source. People. Attachments complicated judgment. Loyalty blurred clean decisions. Affection made strong men pause at the exact moment they should move. Hyun Woo had built his entire philosophy around avoiding that weakness. Distance was discipline. Control was protection. And whatever remained of the past was better left undisturbed. For a long moment, he watched the city in silence, expression carved from calm precision. To the outside world, Hyun Woo was exactly what he appeared to be. A man who had mastered the cost of power and paid it without regret. Untouchable. Unmoved. Unbreakable. At least, that was the story his empire still believed. Because somewhere deep beneath the steel structure of his control, a name he had not allowed himself to think about in years was already beginning to surface again. Quietly. Patiently. And Hyun Woo had no idea yet how expensive that memory was about to become. Amara Okafor built her life on quiet decisions. Not the kind that drew attention. Not the kind that asked permission. The kind that kept you standing when everything else tried to pull you under. By sunrise most mornings, she was already awake. The small apartment in Port Harcourt held the soft discipline of someone who refused to let chaos take root. Neatly folded linens, a clean kitchen counter, shoes aligned beside the door with careful precision. Peace, she had learned, was something you maintained, not something you found. She moved through her routine with practiced calm, tying back her hair as golden morning light filtered through the curtains. Outside, the city was already stretching awake. Distant engines, vendors calling softly, life beginning its daily negotiation with survival. Inside her apartment, everything remained controlled. Intentional. At least on the surface. Amara poured hot water into a plain ceramic mug. Her expression composed in the quiet way people wore when they had learned how to carry history without letting it show. To anyone watching, she was simply a disciplined woman living a careful life. They did not see the steel beneath it. They did not see the choices she had made years ago, the ones that had required her to walk away from a man whose world was built on power and quiet destruction. Hyun Woo. The name rarely crossed her mind now. Not because it meant nothing, but because it had once meant too much. She had understood him better than most people ever would. The control, distance, the dangerous calm he wore like armor. Loving a man like Hyun Woo had never been the problem. Surviving his world had been. So Amara chose something different. She chose space. She chose stability. She chose a life that did not wake up every morning under the shadow of invisible enemies. And slowly, patiently, she built it. Her work spoke for her now. Clients trusted her steady judgment. Colleagues respected the quiet authority she carried into every room. She did not need loud victories. She preferred lasting ones. Some instincts never fully slept. As she moved toward the window, something in the air felt just slightly off. Not enough to alarm, but enough to make her pause. Her gaze swept the street below with casual precision. Nothing obvious. Just morning traffic. Delivery bike. A woman haggling with a vendor. Normal. Amara exhaled slowly and stepped back. Probably nothing. But life had taught her one rule she never ignored. When peace comes too easily, you pay closer attention. And somewhere far beyond the quiet order of her carefully built world, forces she had once walked away from were already beginning to shift. Quietly, deliberately, and much closer than Amara Okafor realized. The alert was subtle. That alone made Hyun Woo pay attention. It appeared buried inside a routine risk sweep, a minor anomaly most analysts would have cleared without a second look. A surveillance overlap. A flagged movement pattern near a low-priority civilian zone. Ordinary. Too ordinary. Hyun Woo stood motionless in his penthouse office, the soft glow of the city reflecting across the glass wall behind him. One hand rested lightly against the edge of his desk as his eyes moved across the report again. Low. Precise. Absorbing what the data was trying very carefully not to say. Run the pattern history, he said quietly. Across the secure line. His intelligence chief responded immediately. Already in progress, sir. Course it was. Hyun Woo didn't employ slow people. Still, something about the numbers pressed faintly against his instincts. That quiet internal signal he had learned long ago never to ignore. Empires didn't fracture from obvious threats. They cracked from the small things everyone else dismissed. A soft chime interrupted the silence. Additional data loaded onto the main screen. Hyun Woo's gaze sharpened. 3 separate surveillance pings. Different timestamps. Different angles. Same geographic radius. His jaw tightened slightly. Coincidences existed. Patterns did not. Cross-reference local activity, he instructed. Brief pause. Then, there's no registered operation in that zone, sir. Which meant someone was moving carefully. Professional. Uninvited. Hyun Woo stepped closer to the screen, the cool light casting sharp lines across his controlled expression. The map expanded, narrowing into a familiar district in Port Harcourt. And then he saw the name attached to the residential grid. Amara Okafor. For exactly 2 seconds, The air in the room shifted. Not visibly, but enough. Hyun Woo's fingers stilled against the desk. Interesting. Very interesting. Most men would have reacted emotionally to seeing a name from their past surface inside a potential threat pattern. Hyun Woo did not allow himself that luxury. Emotion blurred accuracy. Accuracy kept people alive. Deep scan, he said calmly. Yes, sir. Data began unfolding in layers. Residential routines, traffic flow, communication silence, movement irregularities so faint they almost looked accidental. Almost. But Hyun Woo knew better. Someone else had started looking in her direction. The realization settled cold and precise in his chest. Not coincidence. Not random. Deliberate interest. His gaze hardened slightly as he studied the screen, mind already recalculating exposure risk, probability trees, response windows. Amara had built a quiet life. He could see that clearly now. Disciplined, careful, unconnected to his world in any visible way. Which meant if predators had started circling her orbit, they were either very patient or very informed. Neither possibility pleased him. Expand observation grid, Hyun Woo said softly. Discreet coverage only. Beat of silence. Then, understood, sir. The line went still. Hyun Woo remained where he was, eyes fixed on the glowing map. 4 years. He had maintained perfect distance from the one variable he never fully trusted himself around. Now the board was shifting. And something deep in his instincts, cold, experienced, rarely wrong, was already warning him. This pattern was not going to stay small for long. The confirmation arrived just before dawn. Lee Hyun Woo was still awake. Sleep had never been a necessity, only a convenience he used when the world was quiet enough to allow it. Tonight, the city lights beyond his penthouse glass felt sharper, more watchful, as the encrypted file opened across the main screen. He did not move immediately. Stillness had always served him better than reaction. Report, he said. His intelligence chief's voice came through low and controlled. Deep scan completed. Civilian profile verified. No active ties to hostile networks. There is one additional flag. Hyun Woo's gaze cooled. Continue. The subject has maintained unusually tight personal records over the last 6 years. Financially clean. Movement disciplined. But there is one restricted file tied to her residential history. The air in the room shifted almost imperceptibly. Hyun Woo stepped closer to the screen. Open it. The file decrypted slowly, line by line. Medical registry. Private enrollment record. Guardian documentation. Hyun Woo's eyes moved once across the page. And stopped. For exactly 3 seconds, the man known for absolute control did not breathe. 6. Birth window aligned with a timeline he had not allowed himself to revisit in years. The silence in the penthouse deepened. Not shock. Hyun Woo did not shock easily. Calculation. Cold. Precise. Relentless. Run genetic probability, he said quietly. Across the line, a brief hesitation. Sir, without direct sample. Run it. Yes, sir. Minutes passed. Not long by most standards. But in Hyun Woo's world, time had a way of stretching when the variables became personal. Finally the screen updated. Probability index populated. High confidence paternal correlation. The room went very still. Hyun Woo stared at the result, expression carved into something unreadable. The city lights reflected faintly in his eyes, but whatever moved behind them stayed locked behind years of disciplined control. Amara Okafor. Of course she had built her life quietly. Of course she had cut every visible tie. She had always understood risk faster than most people around her. His jaw tightened, not in anger. In recognition. She hadn't hidden out of fear. She had hidden out of strategy. Maintain full discretion, Hyun Woo said at last. His voice was calm, but something underneath it had sharpened. No direct contact. No disruption to her routine. Yes, sir. The line went silent. Hyun Woo remained where he stood, gaze still fixed on the glowing data. 4 years, he had built his empire on one unbreakable rule: distance preserved control. But now the past hadn't just resurfaced. It had taken form, breathing, living, unavoidable. Slowly, almost unconsciously, Hyun Woo's hand rested against the edge of the desk. The board had changed, and for the first time in a very long time, the man who ruled through violence understood something with absolute clarity. This situation was no longer theoretical. It was personal, and personal variables had a way of turning even controlled empires into war zones. By sunrise, the protection was already in place. Not visible, never visible. Lee Hyun Woo did not believe in loud moves unless the situation demanded them. Real control operated quietly, in adjusted patterns, in problems that disappeared before anyone realized they had existed. Amara Okafor would not know she was being watched. That was intentional. Hyun Woo stood before a wall of live feeds in his penthouse office, expression composed as multiple camera angles cycled through her residential district in Port Harcourt. Traffic flow, foot movement, entry points, exit routes, every variable mapped, every blind spot reduced. Shadow perimeter established. His security chief reported through the encrypted line. Local assets positioned. No exposure risk. Hyun Woo's gaze remained on the central screen. "Keep distance," he said calmly. "If she detects anything, you've failed." Brief pause. "Yes, sir." He expected nothing less. On the ground, the changes were almost invisible. The flickering streetlight near Amara's building was quietly replaced overnight. A routine police patrol route was subtly adjusted. A small security upgrade appeared at the pharmacy 2 blocks away, filed under routine infrastructure improvement. Coincidences? That was the goal. Hyun Woo watched as Amara stepped out of her building later that morning, movements calm and unhurried. Her posture carrying the same quiet discipline he remembered. She hadn't changed where it mattered. Still observant, still careful, still unaware of just how close the world he once kept away from her had begun to move again. His jaw tightened slightly. "Any secondary movement?" he asked. "Negative so far," the reply came. "But we are monitoring an unidentified signal overlap at the outer grid." Hyun Woo's eyes sharpened. There it was again. The faint pressure at the edge of the board. Not confirmed. Not aggressive. But present. "Track it," he said softly. "Do not engage." "Yes, sir." The line clicked off. Hyun Woo remained still, gaze drifting briefly to a smaller screen in the lower corner. A young boy sat at a small table, focused on his workbook, posture unusually composed for his age. For a fraction of a second, something unfamiliar pressed quietly against Hyun Woo's control. Not weakness, not hesitation, recognition. It vanished as quickly as it came. Control reasserted itself smoothly. Because this was not the time for emotional recalculation. This was containment, protection, preparation. As Amara disappeared into the morning flow of the city, Hyun Woo's instincts remained sharply alert. The board was shifting faster than he preferred. And somewhere beyond the careful net he had deployed, something else was already testing the edges. Quietly, patiently, waiting. Hyun Woo's expression cooled another degree. If someone out there believed they had found an opening, they were about to learn exactly how far his protection was willing to go. Predators rarely rushed. They tested first. The first probe hit one of Lee Hyun Woo's secondary shipping routes just after midnight. A minor delay flagged as routine customs friction. On the surface, it was forgettable. The kind of operational noise his network absorbed daily without consequence. Hyun Woo noticed anyway. He always did. By morning, 2 more irregularities surfaced. A data scrape brushing the outer edge of one of his financial shells. An acquisition partner suddenly requesting unusual contract revisions. Small moves. Careful moves. Coordinated moves. Hyun Woo stood in the center of his office, hands loosely clasped behind his back, eyes moving slowly across the intelligence wall as fresh reports populated in quiet succession. "They're testing response latency," his security chief said carefully. Hyun Woo didn't answer immediately, because the pattern was already clear. "They smell diversion," he said at last. The room went still. For years, his empire had projected one consistent truth. The chairman's attention never fractured, never drifted, never left exploitable gaps. But recently, resources had shifted. Surveillance bandwidth had expanded in very specific directions. And somewhere in the darker corners of the global network, someone intelligent had started connecting the dots. Hyun Woo's gaze flickered briefly to the smaller monitor at the edge of his display. Amara's district. Still quiet. Still secure. Still under his shadow. His jaw hardened slightly. "Source identification," he ordered. "We're narrowing the field," came the reply. Multiple syndicate signatures showing preliminary interest patterns. Course they were. Hyun Woo had not built his position by underestimating predators. Across the world, in a private room far removed from Seoul's glass towers, another group of men studied their own intelligence grid. "His movement profile changed 3 weeks ago," one of them murmured. "Personal variable?" another asked. A slow, knowing smile answered. "Everyone has one eventually." Back in his penthouse, Hyun Woo's secure line vibrated once. Priority alert. Unidentified surveillance sweep detected. Within extended proximity of Amara Okafor's residential zone. The temperature in the room dropped instantly. Cold. Focused. Decisive. "Details," Hyun Woo said quietly. "Observer is professional," his chief replied. "Not local. Pattern discipline suggests syndicate-level training." They had already started circling closer. For a long moment, Hyun Woo said nothing. His mind moved with surgical speed, recalculating threat trees, exposure windows, countermeasure layers. The board was no longer stable. And someone out there had grown bold enough to test his perimeter while his attention was divided. Mistake. Very expensive one. Slowly, Hyun Woo stepped closer to the main display, eyes hardening to tempered steel. "Expand shadow grid," he said softly. "Full spectrum discretion. I want ghosts watching ghosts." "Yes, sir." The line went dead. Hyun Woo remained motionless, the city glowing quietly behind him. They thought they sensed weakness. They thought the empire had shifted. What they did not yet understand was that Lee Hyun Woo had built his power in environments far more dangerous than this. And if his enemies wanted to step closer to the one variable he had chosen to protect, then the next phase would not remain quiet for long. Amara noticed the silence first. Not the peaceful kind she had spent years carefully building around her life. This silence felt arranged, too clean, too deliberate. She paused at the gate outside her building, keys resting lightly between her fingers, eyes scanning the street with casual precision. Morning traffic moved as usual. Vendors called out their prices. A delivery bike rolled past in a slow, uneven line. Normal. But her instincts did not relax. They rarely lied. Amara stepped onto the sidewalk, posture calm, pace unhurried. Anyone watching would see nothing unusual, just a composed woman moving through her routine. Inside, every sense was sharpened. Across the street, a man leaned against a kiosk, head lowered toward his phone. Ordinary enough. Except he hadn't moved in the last 2 minutes. Her grip on her bag tightened slightly. Don't assume. But don't ignore. The quiet rules that had kept her safe for years slid back into place with practiced ease. She kept walking. High above the city, inside a darkened command room thousands of miles away, Lee Hyun Woo's surveillance grid updated in real time. Subject awareness increasing, one of his operatives reported quietly. Hyun Woo's gaze remained fixed on the live feed, expression carved from calm precision. Course she noticed. Amara had always been observant, always just a step ahead of what the world expected from her. What concerned him wasn't her awareness. It was the second presence his team had flagged 12 minutes earlier. Unidentified. Professional. Watching the same target. His jaw hardened. Maintain shadow distance, Hyun Woo said quietly into the secure line. I want confirmation on the secondary observer. Yes, sir. Back on the street, Amara reached the pedestrian crossing but didn't step forward when the light changed. Instead, she adjusted the strap on her shoulder bag and used the reflection in a nearby shop window to sweep the street behind her. Her movement. Too controlled to be coincidence. A cold ripple slid down her spine. Someone was watching. Not close enough to trigger panic, but close enough to matter. Inside Hyun Woo's command center, the air cooled another degree as new data populated across the screens. Secondary observer confirmed, the security chief said. Pattern discipline suggests syndicate training. So the predators had moved closer than expected. Hyun Woo's eyes darkened slightly. The board was shifting faster now. On the ground, Amara finally crossed the street, movements smooth, composed. But her mind was already adjusting routines, mapping exits, recalculating risks the way survival had taught her to do long ago. She didn't know who was watching. She didn't know why. But she knew one thing with absolute certainty. This wasn't random. And somewhere in the distance, forces she had worked very hard to leave behind were beginning to close in again. Quietly, patiently, and far too close for comfort. The knock came just after nightfall. 3 precise taps. Measured. Controlled. Amara went still in the center of her apartment. The feeling from earlier, that thin, persistent pressure at the edge of her instincts, sharpened instantly. Her gaze shifted toward the door, every sense quietly alert. No one visited her unannounced. Slowly, she crossed the room and activated the small security screen beside the frame. And the air left her lungs. Lee Hyun Woo stood outside her door. Immaculate. Unmoved. Dangerously familiar. For one brief second, memory hit too fast. Late nights, quiet conversations, the way he used to look at her like he was already calculating the cost of caring. Then the steel returned. Amara opened the door. Silence poured between them. Up close, he looked exactly like the man she remembered. Tall, composed, dressed in dark perfection. But his eyes carried something new, something sharper, something that felt dangerously close to urgency. Her arms folded slowly across her chest. You shouldn't be here, she said calmly. Hyun Woo's gaze moved over her face with quiet precision, as if confirming she was real and not something pulled from memory. I didn't come for permission, he replied. The old tension sparked instantly. Familiar. Unfinished. Amara's chin lifted slightly. Then you came for the wrong reason. For a moment, neither of them moved. The years between them felt thin. Fragile. Like one wrong word could break something that had never fully healed. Hyun Woo stepped closer. Not invading, but close enough that the air between them tightened. You're being watched, he said quietly. No hesitation. No softening. Just fact. Amara's pulse kicked once, hard, but her expression remained controlled. I've handled worse. His jaw tightened just slightly. I know. 2 words. Heavy with recognition, respect, and something far more personal that neither of them named. Amara studied him carefully now, eyes sharp. So what is this, Hyun Woo? A warning before you disappear again. Something shifted behind his composure. Not weakness. Decision. For the first time since arriving, he stepped fully across the threshold. I'm not stepping back this time, he said softly. The words landed like a fracture in the quiet room. Because this was the man who had built his empire on distance. The man who believed proximity created risk. And yet here he was. Closer than he had ever allowed himself to be. Amara's breath slowed, but her eyes did not soften. You don't get to rewrite the past because you suddenly decided to show up. Hyun Woo held her gaze, unflinching. This isn't about the past, he said. Beat of silence. Lore. It's about what's coming. The room went very still. Outside, the city moved as if nothing had changed. Inside, the line he had held for years finally broke. The king had stepped into the light. And neither of them would walk away from what came next unchanged. Hyun Woo did not sleep that night. By morning, the first pieces of his empire were already moving. Quietly, decisively. Across 3 continents, directives began flowing through encrypted channels. On paper, the changes looked routine. Minor divestments, contract realignments, security reallocations. To anyone outside his inner circle, it would read like ordinary strategic refinement. It was nothing of the sort. Hyun Woo stood in his penthouse office, city light bleeding slowly into dawn behind the glass. One hand rested against the edge of his desk as the restructuring models updated in real time across the main screen. Phase 1 executed, his chief strategist reported. 2 high-exposure shipping lanes have been reassigned. Shell network reduced by 18%. Financial insulation holding. Hyun Woo's expression remained composed. Continue. Yes, sir. For years, his empire had been built for expansion. Reach farther. Move faster. Strike first. Now the architecture was changing. Not weaker. Smarter. Cleaner. Less visible to the kind of predators who hunted for leverage through proximity. His gaze shifted briefly to a smaller monitor off to the side. Amara's district grid, still running under full shadow coverage. Movement normal. No confirmed hostile advance. Now. His jaw tightened slightly. Distance had once been his strategy. Keep her far enough away, and the danger would never touch her. He understood now how flawed that calculation had been. Power didn't reduce risk. It attracted it. Chairman, his security chief said carefully, if we continue reducing outer exposure at this rate, competitors will notice the contraction. Hyun Woo's eyes remained on the screen. Let them notice. A brief silence followed. Because this wasn't retreat. It was repositioning. Every eliminated vulnerability closed another potential path toward her. Every Titan network reduced the number of ways his enemies could reach into the one space he had finally decided to protect openly. For the first time in years, his strategy was no longer built around dominance alone. It was built around preservation. Hyun Woo straightened slightly, posture settling back into its usual controlled stillness. Begin phase 2, he said quietly. Yes, Chairman. Across the global map, new movement rippled outward. Security layers thickening, partnerships shifting, silent pressure pushing back against the syndicates that had started circling too close. The board was changing. Deliberately. Irreversibly. And somewhere in Port Harcourt, Amara Okafor was still moving through her carefully built life, unaware of just how much the balance of power around her had begun to shift. Hyun Woo's gaze lingered on her district one moment longer. Cold. Focused. Certain. He had built his empire with violence when necessary. But this time, he was rewriting it for something far more dangerous. Something personal. Because the man who once believed distance was the safest form of protection had finally made his decision. And Hyun Woo did not make the same mistake twice.